Okay, we are going to start by talking about the least glamorous, least exciting part of this whole process, which is the thumbnail and then the rough. But in my opinion, this is also the most important part and is very easy to get impatient. So believe me when I say spending time here is going to save you time later. Because really my whole process is designed around sort of wasting time when it's cheap and then not wasting time when it's expensive. Because when you have a finished rendering like this, making a big scale change is a lot of time. That means you have to sort of erase a lot and then touch it up where you've changed it. It's a pain. But if you have something loose and messy and flat, changing something is easy because it doesn't need to look nice. Easier still, if you have a sketch pad and a pen, you can make a million changes or just throw it away and do 10 more drawings. So the process is sort of like a big funnel. You start really big and wide and you'll see what works and what doesn't work, and then you'll hone it down further and further, and eventually you'll come to a finished rough. And after that point, you're sort of locked down. You're not going to be making big changes anymore because everything you're going to be doing is so time consuming. Rendering is slow. It just is. There's no way around it. So what you want to do is not render anything twice. And the way you avoid rendering something twice is by drawing two thumbnails and throwing one of them away. Again, make the mistake when it's cheap. Don't make the mistake when it's expensive. So let's see the final rough that I ended up with. Here it is. And it is probably a little more detailed than my average rough, but that's because this series was going to be important to kind of go through in a linear order and not do any backtracking. And really, the amount of clarity in your rough is totally up to you or your client. But let's examine what's going on in mine. The first thing you notice is there is a very visible character that is silhouetted against the middle ground and background. As sort of a storytelling element, you see him and you wonder what he's about to do. He's probably going to go driving off through the archway, and you know that because of some intentional choices I've made. You know that because he is looking in the direction of the arch. You know that because I've made some sort of visual arrows on the ground. These reflections in the water point all the way that he is going to drive. And in a certain way, you know it because it's the focal point. It is a high contrast, very geometric shape. It just screams attention. And I've gone through great lengths to make everything else have less contrast and to demand less attention. Another thing we have going for it is sort of an epic scene, which you know because it is an upward angle camera. You are either a worm on the ground or a very short character looking up at this heroic main character. We know this, of course, because we have all the verticals in our scene are converging towards a vanishing point. This is 3-point perspective. It's also a scene that I wanted to feel big, and in order to do that, I put in some scale elements. In the very foreground, you see a barrel, and we know roughly how big a barrel is compared to a character. Then in the middle ground, you see two doorways. Now, this is intentional. One doorway tells you something. That's a good start. But if you have two doorways on the same plane, you can tell, oh, well, I know they're the same height, and one's smaller than the other, so that must mean we're receding into space. Then you keep receding, and then you get to a really, really big doorway, also known as an arch, and by extension, we understand how tall the arch is. And the fact that there's rooftops that sort of continue up out of the frame, we know, wow, this place is really big, really tall, and it's sort of a dramatic landscape because of it. So creating this visual hierarchy was not an accident. It is how you sort of set the stage to give a very specific impression. But that is not where my sketch process started. I started with a sketchbook, and I was drawing just kind of interesting ideas. I had in my mind at first an idea that there was a big crowd chasing one character, and then he ends up in a dead end. And that was just one thumbnail that stood out amongst another page I had created of sort of flops. So I took that thumbnail and then I created another page of just architecture, because in my mind, part of this scene was an interesting slum landscape. And that was almost like its own character. So I took this and I scanned it into the computer, and then I did some very quick tones. Now I spent a little longer on this thumbnail here in the center. But what this did was it gave me a more concrete idea of sort of the tone palette that I was going to be working with. No details, no fine rendering, just a quick sense of what this space is. And this would be where I would then begin to get reference and think about more specific details. But you can even see by this original thumbnail that I had a story happening. It was an angry crowd, almost like a Frankenstein scene, which are dark, and they're contrasting against the character who is light, and he is illuminated in a sort of a dark dead end. Now, as it happened, this was going to end up being too much roof and not enough ground level, because I still wanted to show off how you could use sort of different materials and different rendering techniques, and in a scene that's mostly roof, I just couldn't show off those things. But what I had established is a setting that I liked and sort of a general mood. Cool. Okay, so now the next step was I'll go back to the drawing board and I'll start thinking of a different camera angle. Because remember, this is all storytelling, so I have to sort of put myself as the director in this imaginary landscape. And then it becomes, well, what would be another way to shoot this scene? Before it was maybe like a helicopter shot. Well, now I'm going to do maybe a low angle. So for these sketches, I was really just thinking sort of spatially, what would be interesting from a storytelling standpoint. And pretty immediately, the arch became neat when seen from a sort of low angle and illuminated at the top. And then maybe as we sort of receded down towards street level, things would get a little darker. So in this way, we still get that cool verticality, but we're doing it from a low angle instead of a high angle. So at this point, I take the one successful, we'll call it a sort of thumbnail. It's still very messy at this point. It is a flat image. I'm not using Photoshop layers or anything. And I just enlarge it a bit. Because here I'm okay with sort of the broad strokes of my composition, but I want to start changing the specifics. Remember, we're going from broad to narrow. So my first step was, well, I need to bring back that character. This is sort of an empty scene. So I put in one character that had a light local value. Well, if I'm going to have a light local value stand out against a light wall, I've got a problem. So in this case, what I decided to go with was sort of receding into shadow as we get lower in elevation. So in this way, the white character stands out against the white wall just because of sort of a lighting trick. So next I hid the character and decided, okay, what do these shadows look like? Because it is essentially a blank wall with cool shadow patterns. So the shadows all of a sudden become an important design element. So I looked at photos of slums and I noticed that there was a lot of jumbled wiring. So what I wanted to do was imply that there's wiring out of the shot, as in there's wires somewhere overhead, and the only reason we know they're there is because they are casting shadows onto the architecture. And this is just an easy trick to make your scene feel bigger than it is, because if you can imagine the fact that there's wires somewhere beyond the frame, then you're imagining it is a large set. So that's good. Now I started to refine the ground a little bit. And remember, I wanted to point people visually towards the arch, as in I knew I was going to have a character and imply that they're going to be traveling somewhere. So I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll have some sort of reflections to be a light value to contrast against the dark, and I can use those as almost like arrows winding off into the distance. And then at this point, I realized that the original idea of the small character didn't really work for the good foreground. All I'd have would be a middle ground and a background, but what I needed was something more prominent in the foreground. So here I switched my character from being sort of a light clothing character to be a silhouetted, like a wanderer or a vagabond or something. And then I found myself in sort of a costuming problem, because right now I have a very specific silhouette of a character that might really fit better in a fantasy setting instead of a sci-fi setting. And what I wanted to have was sort of a lost in time, like maybe it was a slum that has fancy technology because it's on a far-off planet in the future, but it's still very run down. So with that in mind, it was time to swap out that character and just try different characters. And this is why experimenting at this stage is so much easier. Because if I wanted to put in a new character when my illustration was almost finished, this would be very time consuming. But at this level, it was a little easier. Okay, so now we have two major changes happening. The other change is that I have shifted the arch. Now, I have made it a little bit narrower in order to make this possible, but what I realized was when I only saw half of the arch, it was a bit of a missed opportunity, because geometric shapes have impact. If instead of having an arch, I had had a wall with a circle cut out of it, it would have been even more of an impact. But that's not really architecture that we see very often. So an arch is half of a circle with straight walls. This is a very strong shape, and as such, it really demands attention. But covering up half the arch was sort of throwing away this opportunity. So at this point, I decided, well, okay, I need the arch shape. How can I get it back? So I recropped the image a little bit. I sort of pushed in tighter, and then I just shifted my architecture. And because we were working flat and things can be sloppy, this was a lot easier than if I had done it later in the process. And then finally, happy with the way the architecture is looking and happy with the overall value balance, I decided to play around a little more with the character. And the character I ended up on was Motorcycle Guy. Because I've seen enough of those action movies where you've got some cool motorcycle chase through the slum with, you know, all the mud and all the jumping over boxes and stuff. So anyway, here we are. At this point, I feel confident that I have a nice sort of clear read. You can see the character, you know where he's going to go, and it's relatively simple from a value standpoint. And this is what I like. This is what I'm going to call the rough done. And from this point forward, we are just going to be clarifying this image and polishing.